Okay, so in our last section of notes, we talked a great deal about some of the events that led to the momentous decision to break with Great Britain. We also talked about some of the new state governments that were established with the coming of independence. So in this section, we are going to talk about how essentially now that we are free of Great Britain, we are an independent nation, we need to establish some sort of regular and permanent government. And so we're going to talk more about this first attempt to establish a lasting government for our new nation. And that first attempt is going to be the Articles of Confederation. And this is our very first Constitution. It was created to provide, a lasting government. However, the chaos brought about by the weaknesses of the document led to a movement for change towards a more powerful central government and essentially the creation of our Constitution that we currently have and are using today. All right, so the Articles of Confederation. So what was the Articles of Confederation? This was a firm league of friendship among the states. It was intended to be our foundation, our strength, but it was really weak. It was a very weak document. It created a very weak central government, and it gave all power to each individual state. Each state kept its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power not expressly delegated to Congress. And so essentially each state had its own power to create its own currency, to regulate trade. And so there was no way to enforce laws. There was no executive branch. There was no judicial branch to interpret the laws. There was only one branch of government, and that was the legislative branch. And the states, chose the representatives. They told them who to vote for or who to vote for. They ultimately made all of these decisions, and there was no central government making these big decisions. States came together for common defense, security of liberties, and general welfare. The Articles did not go into effect immediately. Maryland did not ratify until March 1st, 1781, and it was on this date that the Second Continental Congress declared the Articles effective. So the government structure, again, under the Articles, Congress was the sole body. There was no executive or judicial branches of government. It was unicameral. Remember, bicameral means a two-house Congress, which would be a House and a Senate. However, under the Articles, there was not two houses. There was just one, which means unicameral. It was made up of delegates chosen yearly, again, by the states, in whatever way their legislators might direct. Each state had one vote in Congress, whatever its population or wealth, and again, no executive or judicial. Each year, Congress would choose one of its members as its president. This person would act as presiding officer or chair, but not the President of the United States. These were some of the powers of Congress. So they were given the power to declare war, make peace, send and receive ambassadors, sign treaties, but no power to enforce them. Again, no executive branch. They could borrow money, however, they couldn't force the states to give money. They could just ask the states, could you donate money? And of course, in most cases, they said no. They had no way to tax the people. Set up a monetary system, set standards for coins. However, the states also could set up their own currency if they wanted to, establish post offices, raise an army. However, they couldn't draft men into war. Again, they just had to ask for requests. They had to request people to send men for the army. Build a navy, fix uniform standards of weights and measures, and settle disputes among states. However, they really had no guidelines on how to go about doing that. If we look at this image here to the right, it says the power is granted by the Articles of Confederation. Again, Congress could raise an army, but had to ask for volunteers. Congress could declare war, but you couldn't win the war without a military. Congress could sign treaties, but no way to enforce the treaties. And then powers withheld by the Articles. Congress could not raise revenue through taxes. Again, could not tax the people. And Congress could not regulate trade and collect tariffs either between states. Okay, so state obligations. A state obligation. By agreeing to the Articles of Confederation, states pledged to obey the Articles and act in the acts of Congress. This meant that they should provide funds and troops requested by Congress. States had to give up their war-making powers, treat citizens of other states fairly and equally, return fugitives that escaped from one state to another, allow open travel between state borders, and states would retain power that was not given to Congress. Some of the other state obligations that are not listed here would be, for example, open trade between state borders, the full faith and credit, to public acts, records, judicial proceedings of every other state. This just meant that each state must recognize official documents and judgments rendered by other states and submit their disputes to Congress for settlement if they were having any issues. Responsible for protecting life and property. Accountable for promoting the general welfare of the people. These are just, again, some of the other state obligations. All right, weaknesses of the Articles. Again, one vote for each state regardless of size for Congress. Again, we have this still in place with the Senate, but we have another House of Representatives added that's based on population. And so that gives the central government more, makes it a larger republic, because again, we have more representatives representing the population as a whole, and more fairly as well. Congress powerless to lay and collect tax or duties. Congress powerless to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. Interstate just meaning from state to state. Foreign meaning from the United States to other countries outside of the United States, obviously. No executive to enforce acts of Congress. No nation, court system or judicial branch. Amendment only with consent of all states. No amendment was ever added. So again, all 13 states at the time had to agree in order for an amendment to be added to the Articles, which was nearly impossible because these states, each had their own individuality and ideas, and especially ideas about government, and so they rarely ever came together. A 9 out of 13 majority required to pass laws, and Articles, again, only really known as a firm league of friendship instead of a uniting nation. The thirst for independence made the new states wary of a strong central government. So question, how is this caution reflected in the weaknesses built into the Articles of Confederation? So answer here, the Articles did not provide for any elements of strong centralized government, including an executive, a national court system, or the power to tax or regulate commerce. And essentially they do this because they're scared. They were just a part of a government, Great Britain's government, that was very controlling and, essentially a monarch. And there was too much power in the central government, and so they did not want to repeat that. They wanted to ensure that the central government was not too powerful, and so they created the Articles of Confederation. And that's essentially what they did. They created a very weak central government, and it was ineffective and weak. All right, so again, here just another outline of the weaknesses and then the outcomes of those weaknesses. So Congress had the power to levy or collect tax. However, what ended up happening, the government was always short of money because again, they had, I said power. They had no power to levy or collect taxes. And again, this was because the government was always short of money. Congress had no power to regulate foreign trade. Quarrels broke out among states, and trading with other countries was difficult. So because there was no government or central government regulating the trade between states. They constantly weren't getting along, and were trying to control how trading would work from state to state, and had different ideas about how that should work, and so they were never really getting along. And again, trading outside of the country was difficult as well because it was not regulated. Congress had no power to enforce its laws. We had no executive branch. The government depended on states for law enforcement. Approval of 9 states was needed to enact laws. It was very difficult then to enact laws. 13 states needed to approve amendments to the Articles. There was no practical way to change the powers of government. And because of that, no amendments were actually added. The government had no executive branch. There was no effective way to coordinate the work of government, no way to enforce the laws. There was no national court system, so no way to interpret the laws. The central government had no way to settle disputes among states, and there were plenty of disputes. Alright, so with a strong central government unable to act, the states bickered among themselves and grew increasingly jealous and suspicious of one another. Some states began making agreements with foreign governments. Most organized their own military forces. States taxed one another's goods and banned some trade. This goes back to the fact that trade between states was not regulated, and so the states did whatever they wanted. Again, taxed one another's goods and banned some trade from certain states. They printed their own money because there was no one currency for the United States. Prices went up and debts were unpaid, leading to violence. And then the Shays Rebellion took place. This was a series of protests in 1786 and 1787 by American farmers against state and local enforcement of tax collections and judgments for debt. So basically with the Shays Rebellion, small farmers began to lose land and possessions for the lack of being able to pay taxes and other debts. And then in fall of 1786, Daniel Shays, who was a former American officer in the War for Independence, and other local leaders, led an uprising that forced the Supreme Court in Springfield, Massachusetts to close, condemning Shays and about a dozen others to death. Early the next year, they unsuccessfully attacked the federal arsenal. State force moved in to quiet the rebellion, and Shays fled to Vermont. In response to the rebellion, the Massachusetts legislature eventually passed laws to ease the burden of debtors. Shays petitioned for and received a pardon in 1781. So a need for a stronger government. Obviously with the Shays Rebellion, it made it very clear that we needed a military in order to put down such a rebellion. And the fact that we could not actually draft men into war and that we had to ask for volunteers or request a military really made it hard for us to protect not only Americans, but also, when we go to war with other countries, we need men in order to protect what is ours. So here, it became clear that we needed a strong central government, one that could draft an army, among other things. So the Articles had created a government unable to deal with the nation's problems. Demand grew for a stronger, more effective national government. And then in Mount Vernon, Maryland and Virginia, they were plagued by bitter trade disputes. They took the first steps in the movement for change. State representatives from Maryland and Virginia met at George Washington's home to discuss their trade problems. This led to the Virginia General Assembly to call for a joint meeting of all states to recommend for a federal plan for regulating trade on January 21st, 1786. So these two states were just sick of the disputes between states, and so they made that first step to say, hey, we need to figure something out as far as trade regulation because this is just getting out of hand, and pretty soon we're not going to be, one country. We're going to be 13 different countries. And then